talk about Studio Ghibli. We'll talk about the Japanese popular culture, which you're working on through Neo magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And then more about Japanese independent cinema.
So the last time we talked, it had been a couple of years, I think, since my Zatoichi book came out. And that research hasn't progressed as yet. It's obviously been a few years since the book came out. That was 2021. I do like to bring up and have talks with researchers and also students every now and again about the influence of Zatoichi and make them aware. Because, yes, the book's out there, but I'll be honest, not every student is reading it. I need to tell them in the lessons that I teach them about this really interesting period of Japanese film history and how it's been influential all over the world. But what I have been made aware of since the book has come out is there's been some further homages to Zatoichi that have come out. There are some older films, a couple of older films, I think. Although annoyingly, I can just think of one off the top of my head at this moment, where Zatoichi has been referenced, kind of parodied as a character. It's none of the official actors that have played Zatoichi, but the character has kind of been parodied in some Hong Kong martial arts films from the 70s, which annoyingly, as is always the case, you find out after the book's published. But also what's been really interesting and what has developed since then is that there have been further homages to the Zatoichi character in recent East Asian productions and also recent Western productions. Like, if I try to get my years right in my head, I think it was 2023 it came out, was John Wick Chapter 4. You seen that film?
Yes.
So you'll know Donnie Yen's character in that film, quite clearly playing a blind assassin. And some of the moves he has in that film, even with his hidden sword, of course, it's quite obvious. He's playing Zatoichi again.
And so just for the people who are listening, maybe they haven't listened to the previous podcast.
Yeah.
Zatoichi is a blind swordsman.
Swordsman.
And the themes are that it's a downtrodden class of blind people who is a masseuse.
Yeah.
And also has this secret skill which no one knows, which is a brilliant swordsman.
Because this is, the Zatoichi films were set in the early to mid 19th century in Japan. So technically still the medieval era. They're in this period called the Tokugawa era, or the Edo era of Japan, it's sometimes called, where it's kind of an enforced period of peace brought on by the shogun government at the time. And everything kind of stays in what we'd call a late medieval period, probably in terms of history around the world. So when the Tokugawa era is established in the 17th century, for over 200 years, I forget the exact number of years, everything kind of stays in this like medieval feudal system, but instead of warring with each other, it's enforced peace. There's still a samurai class, there's still an elite ruling class, but now everything is enforced to be peaceful rather than gearing up for war all the time. And below the samurai, you have merchants, tradesmen, farmers, and you have the Yakuza emerge at this time. They're not called the Yakuza at this time, but basically gamblers are seen as a lower class, but they're trying to aspire and gather wealth, often through corrupt means anyway. This comes out in the Zatoichi films. And you also have blind people as well, who are seen lower than low because of their disability, but they are allowed to take up certain jobs. So as you said, what's often portrayed in the Zatoichi films is he often tries to find work as a masseur, which he can do because he's blind. And other blind people that he meets in the films, or that you can find historical references for, do play music and do other things similar to that. There is, I won't go into full detail about it now because this is a whole piece of historical research that I found. There's different rankings of blind people and how you can, move from one trade to another and become quite respectable if you develop a certain reputation. But Zatoichi isn't one of them because he mixes with the gamblers. And one of his tricks is that through his acute sense of hearing that he's developed because he's blind, not only is he really talented with a sword, which is what what the films mostly play on, but also he can hear dice and how they're thrown in dice gambling games, so he can always win, basically. So this is why he hangs around with gamblers, because he can easily fleece them.
So the senses are kind of heightened, which is a theme as well.
Yeah.
Which works perfect with the swords and his fighting style.
Exactly. Oh, and his sense of smell comes in quite a lot in these films, of course, as it does, and his sense of hearing. So these were hugely popular films. Shintaro Katsu was the Japanese actor primarily known for playing Zatoichi across 26 films and 100 TV episodes. 25 of those films he made from 1962 to 1973. Made after the TV series of 100 episodes that only ran for like 4 years in the 70s. But after that, he played one more film as the character in 1989 before he passed away in the 90s. And then it's been the character has kind of been remade. They've tried to reboot the character, not for a successful film series, but through just a couple of about 2 or 3 individual film titles since. Predominantly in the 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned the recent portrayals in the various films, I find this concept this phenomena fantastic, where a character becomes so popular that it becomes somehow in relation to the audience, it like kind of gets developed, and they have this association with it, and sometimes they even would complain that no, this is not how the character behaves.
Oh yeah.
If you would go out of the lines, and I love it that you mentioned that it's in John Wick, Eye for an Eye, and in the new Daredevil series, some aspects of it.
Well, yes, the new Daredevil series is interesting because what's happening right now on Disney Plus, to the point where I haven't caught up on the latest episode yet, is it's called Daredevil Born Again. It's a revival of the series that used to be on Netflix. Yes. I forget the exact years. Was it around 2008? Was it later than? Oh, it's 2014.
I think I remember watching it when I was doing my master, so it must be 2013.
Right. Yeah. That sounds
something
about right.
Like that. Yeah.
Sounds about right. That was Netflix. That was along with Netflix's other series that they did of Marvel characters, because they also did Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, Iron Fist. But Daredevil, I think, was the most long-standing and probably most successful out of those. Although, I'll be honest, I haven't seen Jessica Jones, and I have heard good things about that. Anyway, sorry, bit of a tangent. But there were, in the original Daredevil series, where Charlie Cox first played the character before it switched to Disney Plus, there were some quite explicit references to Zatoichi. And the references there, just to go back a few steps, what you mentioned in terms of your fascination, what you're really interested in how that character became so popular that you can see his influence in Western culture. What's fascinating there, and what I maybe didn't cover that much in the book, is there's so much variety in terms of how that happened. Because before you get these homages in, say, John Wick, Daredevil, and of course the Star Wars film as well, where Donnie Yen also again played a blind character, and again was also interviewed as he was for John Wick, and said in interviews, "Yes, I'm paying homage to Zatoichi again," showing that he's a massive fan of the character, which is good to know. So that's one thing. He became a fan. He's mentioned this in several interviews. He watched the films in Hong Kong, showing how popular the films were in East Asia. So these films weren't just popular in Japan. If we just think about cinemas, they were making their way over to Hong Kong, mainland China. Most likely, I would reckon some other East Asian countries too. And then as the 70s moves into the 80s, of course, we had the VHS era, and you have some of these films. This happened also with the Lone Wolf and Cub films and other martial arts films from Japan and Hong Kong. They get put on VHS. They're most likely going to be dubbed really badly. Some might be subtitled. In a lot of cases, those are being circulated illegally, because this is the era where bootleg VHS tapes are released as much as legitimate ones. So that would first provide a way that these films enter into Western culture. and that could happen. I imagine this was happening in the UK and USA and Australia, as much as each other. Most historians that have mapped this history before say, that's how these films made their way into the USA. But the likelihood is it happened for UK and Australia as well. And then what you also have later on with Zatoichi is the character's probably most famous revival and reboot was with the Kitano remake, which happened in 2003 by Takeshi Kitano, who starred as the lead, also wrote and directed the film. Is a very well-known. I won't turn the conversation on Takeshi Kitano. That's a whole other podcast, to be honest, Takeshi Kitano. Yeah. But he's such a popular character in Japanese film. Not character. Zatoichi is a popular character. Takeshi Kitano is a very popular figure to this day in Japanese filmmaking and Japanese TV. That was one of the reasons why that was a major success. And that film ended up getting released in cinemas around the world. Such was Kitano's reputation at the time. So for a lot of people, and I have to say myself included, that was my introduction to the character. And when I read more about the film and where this idea had come from, then I find out about the history of Zatoichi. That was an idea I picked up, I'm showing my age now, 2003 when that film comes out. 2004 is when it makes its way to the UK. That's when I'm an undergrad at university myself. And that shows when I was introduced to the character, and I just kind of stuck with that idea since, until years later I finally write a book on the character because my obsession grows so much in that time. So that shows another way that the character kind of enters the zeitgeist, for want of a better word, in popular consciousness. So Kitano's remake has a lot to do with that. And since then, there's other fans that have come along like me that have, wanted to get interest in the original films, watch them as best as possible. There's probably not as much interest in the original TV series because for my research, I ended up having to find basically illegal copies of it online. It hasn't been released in any other way, but it was necessary to go through the series for my research. But the films themselves, the original Zatoichi films and some of the more recent ones have been released through a variety of DVD labels, and I think that interest has come partly because of the popularity that Kitano's remake had in 2003. Yeah. Especially when a big milestone in terms of mapping the history of when Zatoichi films get re-released and introduced to new audiences is when the Katsu's 25 Zatoichi films that he made from 1962 to 73. They're now part of the Criterion collection in a very, very big, shiny box set, which I treasure at home. It's a wonderful box set of the films. And it just shows that's interesting evidence of what Criterion have been doing in recent years with films like Godzilla and the works of Akira Kurosawa and lots of other Japanese filmmakers.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's like... if anyone listening hasn't seen it, for sure, what film would you recommend? Like if they want to get introduced to?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with the way that I did it, which was watching Kitano's remake first. That's a really good, fun and entertaining introduction to the character. It's a different film to the other Zatoichi films in many different ways in terms of how the Zatoichi character looks. Some people think the character acts a bit differently, but it is being portrayed by a different actor. And it's a longer film. It's 2 hours. Most of the original Zatoichi films were made in a really short space of time. As I said, 1962 to 73, and most of them are around 90 minutes. So they're really easygoing, easy to watch action films, very formulaic. If you were to watch those first 25, which I've done, by the end of it, you'll think I've just watched the same film over and over again because they're very formulaic. They're like Westerns. Zatoichi is the guy who's hiding his fighting skills with a sword rather than a gun. Usually finds some corruption going on, some corrupt Yakuza gangsters or local lord, finds the trouble, kills all the bad guys. As it would be understood, the West, very similar to like Western lone gunslinger narrative. And each film really adheres to that formula. There's different aesthetic flourishes, or the amounts of blood might vary from film to film. Especially where he's fighting and who he's fighting against. There'll be some different characterization there. So they could be seen as very formulaic. That being said, there are there are some gems that do stand out compared to the others. I think of the reboot. I mean, the homages to the character are a bit different that we've mentioned, like Daredevil, which I didn't really explain all the homages for. I'll try and remember to come back to that. So Daredevil, Star Wars, and John Wick. They're a bit different. They're entertaining in their own ways. There's also, now I remember it because I quite like this film, even though it's not the best film ever made. It's a very cheesy 1980s action film, but there is one official American remake of a Zatoichi film called Blind Fury from 1989 with Rutger Hauer. He's acting blind, but he's doing it with his eyes open because he couldn't do it with his eyes closed. So there's criticism there and some other aspects of that film which have not dated film, but it's an action film from the 80s. The politics are always going to be questionable today. Despite that, there's some fun things that film does. It has its tongue very firmly in its cheek. It knows it's a ridiculous concept, but it has fun with it. So I quite like that one. And that takes me to, going back to Zatoichi film recommendations, the film that is officially a remake of, a film called Zatoichi Challenged. That's one of the best Zatoichi films.
Fantastic.
It has a typical plot that Zatoichi gets involved in. He finds a young boy whose father has been captured by the Yakuza because they're forcing him to, this shows a bit of the history at the time, the Yakuza are forcing him to make explicit drawings on pottery, basically, pornographic drawings on pottery, basically, which are illegal in medieval Japan at that time. But that Yakuza gang know there's a market for this, an illegal black market, which they're trying to control and trying to create a supply for. So this is why they've kidnapped this pottery artist. Zatoichi eventually gets involved, tries to help this young boy and rescue the father, and it leads to various different fights with Yakuza gangsters and also a samurai who is hiding his identity. And the reason I mention that is it leads to this really quite tense duel at the end, which is one of the best in the series. So long-winded way of saying I recommend Takeshi Kitano's Zatoichi reboot, Zatoichi Challenged. I'll try and boil it down to 3. What's the other one that I'd recommend on top of that one? I'm going to say off the top of my head, what's coming to mind is also Zatoichi and the Chess Expert, which you might think is a very odd title for a Zatoichi film. Like, why is there a Zatoichi film about chess? Which there is to a little bit. The narrative is interspersed with scenes with chess. Basically, Zatoichi is again traveling on the road by himself. In this particular film, he keeps coming against this guy who knows chess and keeps offering to play chess with Zatoichi. So you do have some scenes with it, but it's not what the whole film is about. And it's not chess as we understand it in the West. It's the there's 2. I've learned about this recently. There's 2 different board games in Japan which are translated kind of into the Western word chess. Although I might be mixing up with Go, which is a different game. Apologies to anyone listening that I'm missing up the board games here. But there is also another game called Japanese chess, which kind of is a loose translation of what we understand in the Western as form of chess. And I say translation from Western culture. I am vaguely aware of the history of chess that actually came from Arabian countries, first of all, before it became the popular game that we know today. So this variation of Japanese chess, it's not what the whole film is about. It just happens to be what this character that knows that Zatoichi keeps coming up meeting in this story. And eventually you find out he's a swordsman also hiding his skills for various reasons, tangentially related to a Yakuza gang, which Zatoichi, of course, gets on the wrong side of, ends having to kill a lot of them. So it's your typical Zatoichi story in some ways, but also I have to say what really stands out in my mind in that memory, the journey eventually ends up in this very mountainous area in Japan, and the cinematography is just stunning. There's some really interesting visual flourishes in so many of the Zatoichi films. Now I've mentioned that, some more are springing to mind, but I'll try and keep this short. But that's one of the reasons why Chess Expert really does stand out to me. It's visually quite stunning. As well as, being a really good, typical Zatoichi action-packed story.
Which year is it from?
Oh, now you're testing me. Sorry, it's been a few years since I've written the book. I've forgotten the year it came out. I'm pretty sure that's from the mid to late 60s. Yeah, when you get into I remember the titles from Zatoichi when it gets into the 70s, and that's when the franchise starts to slow down. But I'm pretty sure this is from the 60s era. So this will be mid to late 60s it came out.
Nice.
I do remember Zatoichi Challenged came out in 1967. Chess Expert is either just before or just after that.
I mean, the character, in a sense, for me, I think I've seen like 3 of the films, and I think we streamed here
we
as well.
screened here,
It's
yeah,
like,
Zatoichi and the Chest of Gold. Yeah, just remember that, which is another really good one. Sorry to add to the list of recommendations, but that's really, really good.
Fantastic. But the character is, in a sense, like represents hope.
Yes, it often helps out other downtrodden characters and is hopeful in that way.
And there is always this feeling of, like someone when you are under a lot of pressure and you feel powerless, and there is some guardian angel-ish character who shows up, or a reinforcement comes in. I mean, there is this feeling which I think humans have, which I think this character taps into, which is why I feel just I mean, there's so many aspects as you're talking about, but this is what I have felt watching the films, that it's like a reinforcement or a savior character out of nowhere comes and helps you out of this hopeless situation. And that just there's this joy which you feel watching it. So I can imagine the transcendence of this character across. Even the scene in Star Wars, I mean, at that time when I was watching it, Rogue One. Yeah. I remember, that film, so I was not born in Star Wars era. So, when I started watching it was the Ewan McGregor ones.
Right. Okay.
So
you came to those first, did you? Oh, because I saw the original trilogy on TV when I was growing up in the early 90s. That's when I came across the Star Wars films.
So Star Wars, it didn't make, like, at first such an impression.
Yeah.
Also, the cultural aspect of what it was, it wasn't like that when I was watching it. Because for me, it's like, I'm watching films like Matrix in the era when they are coming out. But I remember watching Rogue One, and for me, I feel like it's one of the best Star Wars films, personally.
Yeah, I personally feel that now. I'm maybe a little bit showing my biases here because it happens to be the film that has an homage to Zatoichi in it. But the more I've rewatched it over the years, I enjoy the other elements of it too. And it really does stand out to me as one of the best ones. I've heard some more stories about its troubling production in the years that have gone since, which I won't go into now. There's plenty of articles online about that. But even so, I'm like, actually, there's still a lot to admire there. There's so much going on.
And I think that is one of the reasons why Endor, coming from the same.
Yeah.
Oh my God. That thing,
series is really good. Yeah.
Wow. It is really good. And I'm really looking forward to the next season. But what I was mentioning, it's the same thing.
And it's funny, we've got that series has come out from Rogue One with an homage to Zatoichi. And just to go back, because I didn't fully explain, we've got the same thing happening with the Daredevil revival, where there were so many nods to Zatoichi in the original series. And I'm glad now I've also mentioned Blind Fury. So just going back a couple of points, because this is the point I make in the book. In the original Daredevil series, you see a lot of Matt Murdock's mentor called Stick. And when he's first introduced, he's dressed in military fatigues. He knows how to fight with a stick and other weapons. When you first see him in the Daredevil series, the first run that was on Netflix, he's actually holding a Japanese sword, speaking Japanese and killing off Yakuza. And like, yes, this is the modern day, but he's pretty much playing Zatoichi.
Yeah.
And I think the actor Scott Glenn himself even mentioned that in a couple of interviews that I found had referenced in the book. So you've got that reference. And the fact that he's in military fatigues as well. Well, in Blind Fury, Rutger Hauer's character is a Vietnam vet who happens to go blind and then learns how to use a sword. So I'm like, there's all sorts of references going on to different incarnations of Zatoichi, and now we've essentially got a blind superhero again, because again Daredevil is back on our screens and rumored to possibly be in the upcoming Avengers movies. I wouldn't be surprised if he turns up in there. But for now, he's got this Disney Plus series, which I have to say at the moment, again, I haven't watched for the most recent episode, but I'm really enjoying. It's great seeing him back on the screen. Yeah,
it's rated really high. I was surprised. Just suddenly it made a noise.
Yeah,
so I was like, it's back.
And as you said as well, we got Andor to look forward to as well. I don't expect Donnie Yen to turn up, but Andor, I really did enjoy the first series, so that'll be good to see too.
I really think they're doing some great piece of TV art.
Yeah, it's taken them a while though, because it's interesting how that's happened. I mean, we could stick with Star Wars to a certain extent with the podcast today in terms of East Asian popular culture, because that franchise has taken so many inspirations from East Asian popular culture over the years. It's not just the Zatoichi references, but just to highlight, the series like Andor have been great, and some of the other things that they've been doing with the franchise recently. But there has been a lot of criticism that I'm aware of. I won't go fully into it now, that they've been producing so many series and other spin-off media.
Yes.
They haven't all been good, but Andor really does stand out as high quality, doesn't it? Yeah.
And just to finish off, and then we move on.
Okay.
I wanted to say that scene sticks out in Rogue One, where Donnie Yen's character is saying, "I'm with the Force and Force is with me," and he's just walking through and everyone is dying.
Oh, that's a wonderful scene. But I think always what first comes to my mind is when you're introduced to the abilities of these characters, and he takes on that whole squad of stormtroopers and kills them. That scene when I first saw it, I mean, I saw glimpses of it in the trailer, and then you see the full thing in the film, and I'm like, yes, he is Zatoichi. Here's what he's doing. Zatoichi in space. What more could you want? Yeah, it's wonderful.
Oh my God, yes. Yeah. Okay, so
just to finish off quickly, I'm hoping to write a short article soon on like recent homages to Zatoichi, not Rogue One, that was mentioned in the book, but in John Wick 4, apparently the character might be coming back for a future John Wick film. We'll have to wait and see if that happens. And the older Zatoichi films that I wasn't aware of when the book came out, and you also briefly mentioned the Eye for an Eye films. These are Chinese action movies set in the medieval era, but they've just happened to put their own blind swordsman character in. I mean, he's not called Ichi or Zatoichi or anything like that, referencing the Japanese character. Just happens to be a guy going blind that also knows how to use a sword. And I'm like, well, I'm not the only one to have seen it. Lots of other people have commented. It's like their interpretation of the character, which is very interesting to see, I have to say. I haven't seen the second film yet, but the first one was really good.
Fantastic. Okay, so Studio Ghibli.
Yes. You wanted to talk about, we can talk on that topic generally, but I know this stems from on the 20th of March, which was a few weeks ago as we were recording this, we hosted here at the University of Greenwich the Ghibliotech podcast hosts. That's Michael Leader and Jake Cunningham, who are both media specialists and producers in their own right. They've got their own podcast called Ghibliotech, which focuses on not just all things Studio Ghibli, actually, as I was about to say. They've focused more recently on other recent animation studios and directors. So they have now a global focus to the podcast, but they've also been involved with other podcasts, video essay production, short film production. So they have their fingers in a lot of different pies, but Ghibliotech has become really successful now to the point where they do public talks, public screenings. They've written a lot of books, unofficial historical guides to like Studio Ghibli and the films, which we were talking about at their recent talk. I've already mentioned they do screenings of the films. They're often at the BFI IMAX and other venues around the UK. And they were happy to come to Greenwich and talk about their various different ventures and their opinions on just the work of Studio Ghibli and lots of other animated films as well. It was great. We had staff and students turn up and members of the public, and they asked all sorts of questions about Studio Ghibli and different animators and animation styles from all over the world. It was a really good conversation.
Is there any particular thing you thought after, just having the whole conversation which might popped up?
Well, I will say It's funny, you mentioned after the talk there, I tried to keep the evening East Asian themed, and a thank you to Michael and Jake. I went and took them to the Korean place that we have around the corner from here. They very much enjoyed the food there, and so did I. I'll be honest, I'd had a couple of little snacks from there before, like their Korean chicken is really good. But yeah, that was the first time in a while I'd sat in there for a full meal, and they enjoyed it, and so did I. So it was a good East Asian film themed evening. Just thinking back to some of the things that we talked about in that talk. Well, what was handy, I think, and a lot of people seem to get out of, is I didn't ask them too many questions, because I've seen so many recorded Q&As and been to a few myself where, and sometimes this can work really well, where the host of the event asks lots and lots of questions to whoever they're talking about, who's an industry specialist or a filmmaker. And often they only squeeze in 10, 15 minutes of audience questions at the end. Sometimes seems to be done as the afterthought. So I just planned very few questions, which ended up being quite lengthy topics that we got into, but we had almost, I think it's not quite, probably just under an hour of time for people in attendance to ask questions. And that seemed to work really well, because as I said, well, no, I forgot to mention earlier, this is 2025 when this happened, 20th of March 2025, and we'd had them over in 2024 as well, and I didn't want the talk to be the same again. We kind of shaped this around one of their most recent books called Ghibli Verse, they've called it, which is all about the spin-off media that has come from Studio Ghibli, or the other spin-off projects. Some are historical, some were creative projects that Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata were involved in before they formed Studio Ghibli. And then a lot of the book also focuses on spin-off media and events that have come out of this, like the recent stage shows that have been in London, the parks and museums you can visit in Japan. Other shorts that they've done, and other films they've maybe helped to produce but aren't officially Ghibli productions. So part of the talk was shaped around that. So I could make the part where I talked to Michael and Jake a bit different in that way compared to when they were here in 2024. I didn't want it to just go over the history of their podcast and book series again. Yeah. But then, opening up to questions, and it turned out we actually had a very different audience from before, a very different group of students. And they each came with, a lot of them came with, particular questions they wanted to ask, whether that was Michael and Jake's opinions on what's better nowadays, hand-drawn animation or CGI, what the potential future is, if any, for Studio Ghibli, because they've done this before though. They've announced they're fully closed down. They're not working on any projects anymore. So we're meant to believe that Miyazaki is retired again, but he said this in 2013, and look what happened in 2023. The Boy and the Heron came out. So we'll see if he is retired or not. So we got into a bit of that, and it was just, I'll try and stop rambling now, but we talked about so many different things in that talk. It was fascinating.
So what do you think of Boy and the Heron?
I did really like it. I saw it at the cinema. It probably is one of Studio Ghibli's best films. Me personally, I didn't think it was Miyazaki's best film. I didn't manage to get into this with Michael and Jake, but people can go and listen to their podcast episode that they have on Boy and the Heron, and they absolutely loved it. They also brought in their producer for the podcast series, Steph, who is a big fan of Studio Ghibli and all things anime. And they all absolutely loved it. They think it might be his best film. When I watched it, and I'll be honest, I haven't rewatched it again since. I probably do need to give it another go. In fact, it's been a while since I've watched all the Ghibli films. I think I need to rewatch them all, if I'm honest. But thankfully, they're on Netflix. Not that they're paying me or anything, but I'll just remind everyone, they're all on Netflix. So there's no excuse really. I do need to rewatch them all. But I do remember after first watching the film, I was like, I'd always felt a bit unsure on The Wind Rises when I saw that, because that was Miyazaki's film he'd made 10 years earlier in 2013, and then famously said, "That's it, I'm retiring now." Yes. But he didn't. And when I came out of the cinema, I was like, I think this has made me appreciate The Wind Rises more. I could see that Miyazaki was tackling with some similar themes and similar subjects in The Boy and the Heron, but doing it in a much more fantastical way because there's so much fantasy imagery, some really crazy ideas and visuals in The Boy and the Heron. But then I could see some of the things he was tackling with were similar to The Wind Rises, and I was like, that film. I think I need to rewatch them both again because it's been a while. But I was left with the thought left with that thought in my head going, maybe I prefer The Wind Rises a bit more to The Boy and the Heron. I'm not saying The Boy and the Heron is a bad movie. If anyone listens to the podcast and wants to come and track me down via email address or social media, I'll say, what's the phrase now? Don't at me. I'm not saying it's a terrible movie. I will want to rewatch it again. I'm really curious to watch it with the dub, actually, because I know they got a really kind of A-list dub cast, loads of A-list actors doing the dub. So I'd like to watch it that way. I haven't got around to that yet. It's not a bad movie. It's definitely not Miyazaki's worst, although I'm trying to think what would be Miyazaki's worst film, because that's a hard thing to try and dare suggest. It's definitely not his worst film. That I just didn't think it was his best, and that might just be because my personal favourites that I came to when I first started getting into Japanese film and anime have always been things like Spirited Away, of course, is fantastic, but personal favourites have also been Princess Mononoke and Nausicaa. Yeah, they're some of my favorites of his.
Nausicaa probably, I feel like, is very much like Dune. So close. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
And that's just the film. What I haven't done, which Michael and Jake, I've heard so many recommendations that people should do this. You should also read the Nausicaa manga, which Miyazaki made, and it expands on that story's theme so much. Apparently, it's really well worth a read. But they have told me it's very, very big. It's a very, very big manga series to get into.
So do you remember or do you know the name of Boy and the Heron, but in Japanese? I think there's that.
Yeah, this is an interesting story which we did get into in the talk.
Oh, you did? Okay, please.
Yeah, because it does come up in the Ghibli-verse book. The fact that when the film was first announced, we only had the Japanese title. In Japan, it was released as How Do You Live? And everyone thought, I can't remember the author's name now. I'm not going to get my phone out because I'll bang the desk and make horrible noise on the recording. But what we did know when the film was first announced, because it was just in the middle of 2023, I think it got announced, with one mysterious poster of this mysterious character, which you eventually realize is a representation of a heron in a kind of bizarre but fantastical way. But there was no explanation with this image when it first came out. You can go find it online. And Jake even said in the talk that we had on the 20th of March, he was like, yeah, I thought it was a dragon at first, how it looked. It's a very mysterious image. And the Japanese words were quickly translated into How Do You Live? And this equates with a very famous coming of age book in Japan, which isn't, from what I understand of it, I haven't read it, it's not a linear story. It's a lot of vignettes in the life of this boy growing up in, I know it's an era in 20th century Japan. I want to say early 20th century, but I think it's around the 30s and 40s in Japan. So around that era of Japan at the time, this boy is growing up. And the author is reflecting on that period of growing up and what he learned from these different little episodic stories. And that led lots of people thinking, oh, is this film going to be an adaptation of that story and kind of a different interpretation of that story? And lots of people saying it's going to be very odd if it's a straight adaptation because it's just these little episodes in the life of a boy growing up. But clearly, I would suggest that, and I think I've heard this as well, that Miyazaki is a fan of that book, like the title, and he thought for what he's doing with this film and some of the ideas that he's taken from that film, it's not a direct translation. You know, when watching the film with so many fantastical things in it, it's not a direct adaptation of that book at all. But you find out that he's taken some of those themes and ideas and clearly just liked the title so much, he decided that's what I'm going to use in Japan. But there's almost next to no knowledge until that poster came out, that mysterious poster. There was next to no knowledge of this book in the West. So that clearly wasn't going to work for an international distributor. So I guess I don't know if it was Ghibli themselves. It might have been, oh God, I can't remember his name now. There's a book written about him, and Michael and Jake have interviewed him. I'm sorry, I can't remember the guy's name, but there's the guy who was for many years an employee of Studio Ghibli and has migrated to Studio Ponnoc now, where lots of the Ghibli animators have gone to continue doing their work. There is a guy who initially lived in America, now lives and works in Japan, who basically is the producer for all the dubs that happen for Studio Ghibli and Studio Ponnoc productions. So he works very hard on trying to translate as best they can, the story into how this would work in the English language. And it might have been him, it might have been someone else in Studio Ghibli, it might have been an international distributor. They probably came up with the title Boy and the Heron. I think it's unlikely it was Miyazaki's decision. But
I think that that title is a mistake, personally.
Do you?
I think so. I think it's because the film in itself is... I don't know why, but when I came back and I'm like, why this title? It doesn't make any sense. It's such a... like an arbitrary title. You see a boy and a heron and you just call it Boy and a Heron, which is fine. But I just felt like that the film is very difficult. There's no doubt about it, in my opinion. It's a difficult film dealing with like the existentialness of being alive.
Yeah. And legacy is very much a theme of it as well, especially with the older characters.
Sure, and like and the death and like going into that realm, and it's a very difficult film. It does impact, and at that time I was actually myself dealing with something like close to within my family with death, so I was open to it. So it made it even more I would say visceral.
Yeah,
watching it, and I also saw it in the cinema, and I was thinking, ooh, I don't think I'm ready to watch it in a cinema because I can't pause it.
I don't think a lot of people in the cinema screening I were in was ready as well, because I remember when I went to see this in Norwich, where I live, I saw it at my local picture house, great venue called Cinema City, but I noticed a lot of parents coming in with their children. And I know that this film, latest production by Studio Ghibli, they've probably loved previous to this film. Ponyo, this is not, nor really Spirited Away, because that's a narrative, or Totoro even. It's definitely not Totoro. This film is dealing with a lot of dark themes, isn't it? As you were aware when you saw it. And I'm just like, I'd have loved to speak to those people afterwards and see what they thought. But British etiquette and all that.
And I think when I came back and I saw the name of the film, and I was like, that puts it into the context. Yeah. If I hear, how do you live? Yeah. Oh my God, it is a question. Yeah. Which is it's
a big existential question, isn't it? Yeah.
And it makes sense. It's like it would put so much context to it. And when I read about some of why, like just the name of it, like then it got changed. Not that like why the name was. I wasn't really aware of what you just told me, that there's a popular series around book around, but there are a series of chapters of those stories.
Yeah, I'm just going by what other people have said. I still haven't got around to reading it, but it was because of this film and interest in it, what Studio Ghibli have done. I think now the book has been translated into English for the first time, purely because of the choice that Miyazaki made with the title. The only thing I can think of comparing it to is the story of Blade Runner. Do you know this?
Yes.
That the Blade Runner film, of course, the story of it is based on Philip K. Dick's book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which they clearly didn't use for the film. Instead, Ridley Scott came across this sci-fi book called Blade Runner, like that title, bought the rights to it, didn't adapt the story at all, just wanted the title for the movie. And as far as I know, that book, again, I haven't read it, to be honest, but that book is about this dystopian future about surgeons having to operate illegally. So hence the name Blade Runner, where that's come
Wow.
from. But he literally just liked that name and decided to buy up the rights, and so he could use it for the title. And now that's turned into a franchise because that's getting a spin-off TV series soon, Blade Runner.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I do know that very well. It's because, and my partner would kill me. So if you find me dead, that's her. But
Why would she kill you? Why?
because I'm about to say that which she hates. So she's
Right.
an actress.
Oh,
So-
she got a small part in it. Oh.
Yeah, but she's
she
like,
been over
do
to-
not mention that. And
Okay.
it's
So was she, because I think I heard, was it happening in Ireland? And they were filming that. I thought they were filming it in Ireland.
I think they filmed in different places.
Right, okay.
I think this was in I if I'm correct, this was in Prague.
Oh, right. Well,
It's-
that makes... Yeah, that does make it sound similar to a Game of Thrones production. They were doing that, filming in Europe, filming in Ireland. Yeah.
It's so yes, I am aware of
Right.
a scene
Okay.
in Blade Runner series. But yeah, she's for you know how like she's working in different projects, but some projects, as you can imagine, comes up with a huge script.
Yeah.
By the time you get there, it gets smaller, and on
Yeah.
the day. In that particular production, I think how they wrote the scene, and it is a very crucial scene. It's a scene, which is you'll see why it's
Yeah.
crucial. But
Okay.
I don't know anything about actual background of the scene other than just the self tape we did. So,
Right.
but I think on the day they just decided that no, this is not how it would work.
Right.
And so it got completely changed.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, no, I am intimately familiar about the Blade Runner.
Yeah. And the more you read into the actual production history, I don't know if this happened with 2049 or it's interesting to hear this happening with the TV series, but the more stories you hear about the original film, how much of this stuff was just made on the fly,
Yes.
these creative decisions just like on a whim.
Yes.
As well as the flip side of that is I know it went through so many script drafts before it went onto the screen. So you have to wonder, how much of Blade Runner is that creative mishmash of all the different script writers, or does one creative voice come through more than others? It's hard to tell with something like that,
Yeah.
especially something that's attained such cult status.
Sure.
since, yeah.
I mean, I love it. I think, yeah, you're right. Like, it's very interesting to see how sometimes so the script, how it was written,
Mm,
the scene in itself reveals something very critical to the franchise itself.
yeah.
And so obviously around it, how they revealed it, they wanted to be very careful,
Yeah.
and they want to, add more time to it.
So are you telling me your girlfriend had to sign lots of NDAs? and
Yes,
stuff?
yes,
All
yes,
right,
yes,
okay,
exactly.
Fair enough.
So in that, it's fascinating to see. They're like, okay, well, that's fantastic. This is the location. This is how it's written. We know theoretically the importance of revealing it, but just logistically, how the cameras are and how the set is, it just wouldn't make any sense. It would seem
Right.
like a repetitive thing if we actually shot it in that way. And so, and even like try to understand like how do we edit, and they're like, okay, we're gonna scrap all of that. Like really on the day when everyone is there, and be like, okay, let's make it first. Let's achieve what we want to achieve. The first thing, the most simplest way, and then to do that they had to like scrap everything, and actually, which means that still the scene is there.
Yeah.
The revelation is there, but the depth and the importance, which I think the writer or the script writer or whoever was involved, maybe even the director themselves were, they were thinking that this is how it would come across. It's just not what it would, like, it just doesn't work
Right.
at that time.
Okay.
And so it's not like they're not making it more important, but I think it's just that now cutting the scene and making it more direct still get the point across.
Yeah, and sometimes, I'll be honest, I'm not a filmmaker like many of my colleagues in the School of Design and Creative Industries now, but I've heard lots of these stories where you're doing things on set and it doesn't directly translate from script to screen. You have to make a creative decision, perhaps on the spot. Does remind me of the fact that not only have I heard colleagues talking about this. I love film podcasts as well. That's what I've been doing over the last few years, really getting into film podcasts. And this point you've mentioned reminds me of what I've been hearing recently on the Post-Mortem podcast, which I'm going through the back catalogue of because Mick Garris stopped that a couple of years ago. But these fascinating interviews that he did with filmmakers and he's a writer-director himself. He's worked on a number of films and TV series. So he's talking with other writers and film directors about having to make those creative decisions on set. And so, yeah, I've heard similar stories there as well, of people working in Hollywood or other parts of the world, being backed by Hollywood studios saying, yeah, you get to the set, sometimes things aren't working. You either have to change the camera angles or make other big creative decisions. And it also reminds me of Takeshi Kitano, who I mentioned earlier with Zatoichi, and how he works. So watching his and hearing about his film process is fascinating because he tries to do as few takes as possible. And if something isn't working, after they've done all the rehearsals and he just wants to film as few takes as possible, he just moves the camera. So it might seem if one actor's fluffing their lines, he'll just be like, well, we're going to see the back of your head now and we'll see different characters. He just makes simple decisions like that. It's really interesting.
Pressure is on.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with that director who's Kitano and some other East Asian filmmakers just famous for, they want to do this as quick as possible. They're not going to do the Kubrick thing of like tens or dozens of takes. Yeah.
Okay. So, what about the Neo magazine? What's happening about that?
Yes. I know I need to do an update on my Zatoichi research at some point. I haven't I was about to say pen to paper, but we're in the digital age, so I haven't started filling a Word document with those ideas since. But what I have been developing recently is the Neo magazine archive here at Greenwich. And this was an idea I thought I'd put into action after I heard, sadly, that Neo magazine here in the UK stopped publishing in 2024. And that was almost exactly 20 years after they first started publishing in 2004. So this has been now, in that time, the UK's longest running magazine on East Asian popular culture.
Interesting.
So they have often written articles on, and I've had a little bit of involvement in this as well, which I'll explain in a bit. They've pretty much been writing articles about things we've been talking about today. They've done a few articles on Zatoichi, homages to East Asian popular culture in Western films. They particularly focused on a lot of their pages on anime series, manga series, live action films, and there's many parts of their magazines are also focused on cosplay and anime fandom, as well as East Asian food. There was sometimes some recipes published. Oh, music. I almost forgot there's quite a lot of pages on Japanese and East Asian bands in there. Often these people are interviewed as well, whether they're bands or film directors or showrunners or creators for manga and anime series. And what was I forgetting as well? There was another aspect. Oh, yeah. They often got articles written by people living in Japan as well, talking about festivals that take place, live events, or just different aspects of Japanese culture and living. So, yeah, anything East Asian popular culture for when Neo magazine was being published, they were covering it. And this was the longest running magazine that we had in the UK on that subject. There's nothing since the magazine. I know we're only talking about a few months since the last issue came out, but I don't think there's any equivalent that fans of that magazine can go to now. And I just thought it would be great to establish an archive. I've since learned it's not the first archive, but I have a different aim with this archive project compared to others. I thought it was important to establish an archive because that's 20 years of history there, either just of the magazine itself or within the magazine you've got 20 years of the reception and impact of East Asian popular culture being documented in that magazine. So as I've said, it's not the first archive. There are other archives which I've become aware of since starting this project. The British Library, as with all magazines and book publications in the UK, they have a full archive of the magazine, but you have to go all the way to their site in Yorkshire to see that because they're preserving it for posterity, as they should. And there's also the Sainsbury Institute in Norwich. Again, I think they're preserving that for posterity as well, all their magazines, but you can go and visit that and see issues of the magazine and study those in depth if you want. I'm now trying to get as many copies as I can in Greenwich so that it can be a study resource. This can be researched and looked at in the future. And I'm hoping to encourage in future here at Greenwich that BA students look at this as well as MA students. And it could also be the generation of PhD projects and postdoctoral research because, you know, it's 20 years of a magazine. It's 245 issues. There's all sorts of different niches and categories within that can be examined. So I don't see why that can't be the basis of several PhD projects as well as undergraduate student projects. I mean, it would be impossible to do just a general project or publication of Neo overall, because that's a massive undertaking if you're going to document every single thing they wrote about in those issues. It would have to be parceled out into different categories and topics within that. But on top of that, I also want to, for want of a better way of putting it, I want to memorialize Neo as much as possible and make what I'm doing at Greenwich more of a public or community archive. I've been told this is the initiative for by one of the great library staff here at Greenwich, Nathan Finlayson. He's been nothing but helpful and has gone above and beyond with the work that he's doing with helping with the archive in terms of the conversations that he's had with me, the aims that this can have and how we can progress this. So he's told me what you have in mind is more of a community archive project where we exhibit, you know, the magazine and get people to interact with copies, especially if we have duplicate copies of the magazine, because we're trying to get an entire collection. We're almost there. I'll come back to the numbers in a moment. But we'd like to exhibit this as publicly as possible. Venues, hopefully, big commercial venues in the future like MCM Comic Con here in London. And they also have other venues around the UK in Birmingham, Scotland, Ireland, and other cities across the UK. So the idea is to exhibit the magazine, get people, it would be great to also talk to people. If we can generate audience research out of this, it would be great for people to talk about their memories of the magazine, or even if we can introduce the magazine to new generations and get their reactions to it and think, oh, this is great. Why isn't this around them anymore? It'd be a bit sad telling them the history and why this isn't around anymore, but it would be good to know their reactions to it and how much they'd appreciate things like this. So that could also be exhibited maybe at galleries, museums, universities around the UK too. So we want to make this kind of a more of an interactive archive rather than just vaulting them up here at Greenwich, which we do have an archive room and space to do, but I don't want them to just gather dust on the shelf and that's it. So on top of them being studied as a resource, I think this needs to be publicised and celebrated publicly as well. Because as I said, there's no other magazine that stuck around that long and did this. You can get in the UK now, this has often been talked in comparison to Neo. There were a few rival magazines that came up over the years, but they never lasted as long. And before Neo came about, you could get magazines like on anime and manga fandom. I think one was called Otaku USA, but you can import them from the USA, but that's very, very expensive to do. It made much more sense to have a Neo subscription until, sadly, they could no longer publish. So yeah, I'm at the stage now with this project of, I've mentioned this idea to a few people, thankfully, people that are also in charge of the research centre budgets here, and they happily gave me some money, specifically from the Creative Futures Research Group, who I'm really grateful to. They've given me what's called some seed funding to, first of all, buy copies of the issues of Neo. And from that, hopefully I can gain more funding from other bodies, either within the university or outside of the university, to then progress to the next stages to actually getting to publicise this, whether that's at research events, first of all, like conferences and symposia, and then maybe move to more public venues at the same time, depending on how this progresses. Just so the Neo magazine isn't forgotten, because I think that's a really important period of history there, 2004 to 2024, and all the issues that they published.
Yeah, love it. I love the idea. This is fantastic. It really is, like sometimes the words we have, which is like knowledge exchange and the impact, but sometimes, which is also important, you do things to fit those things into the assessing categories which we universities sometimes staff, and academics have to fulfill. But this really is the essence of what a knowledge exchange
Yeah,
is.
I'm hoping so, yeah. Because I'll be honest, one of the reasons this came up, I mean, it was, well, partly because of circumstance. I heard the sad news. It came to me out of the blue, as well as, I believe, lots of subscribers of Neo and people following them on social media. There was so much shock when it got announced. Oh, issue 245 coming up. Yeah, sorry, it's going to be the last one. I probably will. I'm talking to the former editor of Neo magazine at the moment, Gemma Cox, who thinks this is a great idea, thankfully, and is helping me source copies of the magazine. Hopefully, I can have a more in-depth conversation with her in future about circumstances of both how Neo started and how she kept that going for so long. As well as sadly how it came to an end. But I have heard some reports from people involved in the magazine and other journalists reporting on when the magazine stopped publishing that it might be down to paper costs and just the cost of running a magazine that unfortunately meant the decision was made to stop because it was no longer financially viable. But I'll see if I can find more detail on sadly why and that decision was made and the circumstances around it in future. We'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just came as such a shock. So that spurred me into action, as well as the fact that, I'll be honest, in terms of my own research career and since the Zatoichi book, I guess, and I've heard lots of other researchers having this problem as well. I've had trouble settling on what I'll do next since the Zatoichi book. I was hugely happy when I got that book completed and published and out into the world, and whether people read it or not, I don't really care. I was happy I finally got that itch scratched, because as I said, when I came across the character as an undergraduate student, I just thought there's a whole history there that hasn't been written. And by the time the book came around to be written, I thought, I'm not going to be the first person to have done this. Turns out I am, in terms of the English language, first person to chart a history of this character and its global impact. And not its global impact, their global impact. So yeah, I'll be honest, I'd struggled to think of what idea to go with next to research. And this is something very different to what I've done before, which has mostly been the publishing of books and articles. And I have wanted to kind of push the boat out in my research career and try and find something that is more focused on knowledge exchange, as you say, and also allows me to apply for funding to get, knowledge exchange initiatives and activities related to it going. And I can also get experience now for funding applications, which, not to go into too much dry detail about it, but universities love anything that brings in extra money that could be used for knowledge exchange events and publicizing the good work that university researchers and maybe also potentially students in the future, they love seeing that. And this project, I'm not just doing it for this reasons. It ticks a lot of boxes there, but it's also a project that I'm really passionate about because I've been such a fan and subscriber of the magazine for so long. And I think I briefly mentioned this earlier as well. I was involved in the publication of it for a short time, just for a few years, from 2015 to 2017, if I remember that rightly. So if there are any subscribers or former subscribers to Neo magazine that are listening, you might think, oh, that name, Jonathan Wroot, is that a little bit familiar? I did do some live action film reviews for them in that time, 2015 to 2017, just doing that part-time while I was trying to get more, develop my CV in academia, basically get some more stuff published, get some more teaching work done so that hopefully I could lead to a permanent job. So I was doing that for a couple of years, funnily enough, before I got the job here at Greenwich. So
fantastic.
Yeah.
So are you thinking like doing events around particular themes which Neo covered?
Yeah, it could be. There's no reason why not. Some of this might be shaped in the future around particular student interests, whether that's BA or MA students or other postgraduate students. There's potential, but there's definitely some ideas I could think of, and this can be shaped around, any particular sponsor or funder or cultural institution that wants to back this project. If they want something particularly geared around a certain theme, there's no reason why not. In terms of like, I'm just thinking of, they're not simple categories, but there's such a variety of them in the magazine, like, things related to horror, horror films, horror anime series, science fiction anime series, coming of age stories, anime series about musicians or sports are hugely popular. And they've done features on manga related to this, not just anime series, as well as lots of different films on these subjects, such as sword wielding characters like Zatoichi, or other samurai films, other martial arts action films. It could be geared around all sorts of things and the things that they covered. Not to mention, I keep forgetting the fact that because there were so many, and I keep kicking myself because there were so many pages dedicated to it, so I shouldn't forget. So many pages dedicated to music, whether it was Japanese rock bands, pop bands, or bands from other East Asian countries as well, and the impact that they had in the UK. There's so much that a potential exhibition, symposia, or other sort of live event that could be shaped around. If we can get funding to start some of these exhibitions happening at MCM Expo, that could be a general look at Neo magazine and some particular issues. But even those could potentially be shaped around certain themes or topics that the magazine covered. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was thinking, well, maybe we'll talk about it, but yeah, I was thinking something like exhibitions and some interactive activities themed around that. Yeah, that'd be fantastic. And then, ending up with some sort of a screening.
Well, there's potential. Well, that relates to another idea that I had, what I'd come back to. There's potential for it to relate to screenings in future. I mean, they were often the first to write about, as much as their publication schedule would let them, about films or big budget adaptations of famous anime and manga series. There's a lot of potential there. And also another thing which I've mentioned a couple of times, but it's important to mention again and not forget, is that cosplay was a big part of the magazine in terms of, I think they used to do they used to publish a lot of guides on how to draw anime and manga characters, which was interesting. I remember those from some older issues of Neo. I think they maybe used to do some guides on how to make particular costumes or elements of costumes, but I know what they featured the most is people designing their own costumes and obviously doing photo shoots dressed up as their favorite characters. Those were featured a lot in Neo. So definitely at something like, if we got this going at MCM Comic Con, basing this all around cosplay would be very, very easy.
Love
because
it.
There's so many cosplayers at the Comic Con events. Yeah.
Fantastic. So, lastly,
Okay.
About the Japanese independent cinema. You were writing an article around it?
I am, yes. I'll come back to that in a moment because I did mention that point briefly. You mentioned screenings. We have an idea for next year, which I forgot to mention with the Ghibliotech talk. Sorry, again, to go back a few points. Michael and Jake loved doing that again in 2025. Obviously, they've been here in 2024. So they've set a challenge to me to this would be great if you can arrange it for the same time next year in 2026. I'm like, okay, should be able to do that in the future. They've even offered a particular talk they could do it around. They said they've done a talk at a few other universities and venues around the UK called, which they called the Z to A of Studio Ghibli. So that'll be them running through the history of the studio, which I think the audience here at Greenwich would be really up for. But I had another idea for 2026 if we can get this idea to happen. And this also goes back to our previous podcast where we had Eric Wong here as well, who's designed a lot of the backgrounds, landscapes, and kind of settings used for the film Belle and the virtual world that's portrayed in that film in You. 2026 is 5 years since that film came out. So if we can do some sort of anniversary screening marking that next year, maybe get Michael and or Jake to come along, maybe do a Q&A with him afterwards. I'll see if we can make that happen. We are developing a good relationship here. If you're listening to this podcast and know it's hosted by the University of Greenwich, you'll know that Greenwich Picture House is not very far away from the university buildings. We now have quite a good relationship with them because the film and TV production students have their films shown there. So if we can get something maybe there or here at the university, we'll see what we can work out. Hopefully we'll have a screening to mark that anniversary, as well as getting the Ghibliotech team back to do another talk. So that's something that I'm working on. And also, while this has all been bubbling along, and going back to the point that I mentioned before explaining the Neo project, that I was, flitting in my academic career thinking what to do next, I was trying to get this article off the ground, which I have got some promising feedback for. Now I've just got to find the time to write and revise the thing. But yes, I also have this interest in Japanese independent film, which, to explain the context of, actually takes me back to my PhD research, if you don't mind.
Please.
My PhD research was on the distribution and marketing of Japanese films in the UK, and I predominantly focused on physical media because it's still the case to a certain extent today that I think the biggest and most interesting variety of Japanese films that comes into the UK at the moment, basically you've got to have a DVD player, ideally a Blu-ray player at the moment, because there's so much stuff being released on Blu-ray. There's a growing number of 4K UHD releases coming out, but the majority of titles are coming out on Blu-ray, and this is a mixture of older Japanese titles and newer ones. So my PhD thesis focused on a lot of that, primarily looking at DVD, and I analysed two labels. One doesn't run anymore, called 4 Digital Asia. They were a sub-label of 4 Digital Media, which I think is still going, but doesn't release any Asian titles anymore. And the other one is Third Window, who are still going. And some interesting recent developments with Third Window led to this idea that I wanted to write about in terms of Japanese independent filmmaking, because where they've been going in terms of their catalogue and titles that they choose to release, there's some very interesting different perspectives on Japanese independent cinema highlighted through what that label is doing, which in some cases touches on areas which haven't been published and written about that much in terms of English language academic works on Japanese cinema. I found this out recently when I submitted a first draft of the article. I got some promising feedback, and some people that I spoke to before I submitted the article saying, yeah, this is important because there's not a lot actually written on this topic, especially in the English language. So yeah, what Third Window are doing are interesting because they, I'm trying to think of the best name for him. I sometimes get his title wrong. Basically, the executive or CEO, the head of Third Window, for want of a better phrase of putting it. I forget to say what his job title is on the website, which is embarrassing because I've talked to him actually quite a few times. I'm talking about Adam Terrell, who's basically the guy in charge of Third Window Films. Used to live in the UK years ago when he started the label in 2007. Sorry, Adam, if I got that wrong. He used to live in the UK and wanted to bring more Japanese and East Asian films to the UK. First of all, his focus was on East Asia broadly. He wanted to bring films over from South Korea, Hong Kong, and Japan. Eventually, he developed more connections and found it was easier to do this with film studios and filmmakers from Japan than the UK. And I think it was not long after 2012, he found it more financially viable to just bring these films over to the UK on DVD and Blu-ray rather than trying to get them released in cinemas as well. That's when it became hugely expensive for him in 2012. And it wasn't that long after that he decided to move to Japan and operate the company from there. Couple of reasons he's done that. He now has a wife and a family in Japan. He's happily settled there. And also being in Japan allows him to develop those contacts more closely in terms of speaking to studios about older titles to release into Third Window Films, as well as keeping his eye on newer titles that are happening. And also every now and again, this doesn't happen as often in his career now, he also sometimes works as a producer on independent films in Japan. So some of the Third Window releases have been independently produced films that he's worked on. I particularly recommend films like Low Life Love, Love and Other Cults, and a film called Barbara, based on an Osamu Tezuka manga. Okay. So he's worked on those films, and he did act as co-producer on some other titles from the Third Window catalogue. I'm forgetting the names off the top of my head. In addition to that, he also works often for film festivals or on behalf of filmmakers for film festivals as a sales agent. So he tries to get films entered into film festivals so they can get screened and then picked up by a distributor. And sometimes that's how he ends up picking up titles himself to distribute through his label. And a lot of those that he's been doing recently have been these really interesting low budget independent features. Like one of them, I don't know if you've heard of this, Raza, it's called One Cut of the Dead.
No.
No, not heard of this.
No.
It's quite famous in the West now because, well, to the extent that I don't recommend this film. It was so famous it got remade in France.
Wow.
Called a film called Final Cut, and I think that's still available on BBC iPlayer. I'm not quite sure why it turned up on there, but I would recommend everyone listening to this podcast go and watch the original. Don't watch the French remake. It's kind of one of those pointless remakes that's shot for shot. Remake. That's the one. It's an amazing film. It was made on a super low budget, something like $27,000, if not less.
Wow.
Yeah.
No way.
And in Japan, it went on to make millions. So in the Japanese box office, I'm not talking about the global box office here, but in Japan, this ended up making more money than Deadpool, Black Panther, Ready Player One, all the big blockbuster films that came out that year. And Japan loves its big Hollywood blockbusters, but this film just made more money than all of them.
That's impressive.
Yeah, and then it picked up some awards, the Blue Ribbon Awards and the Japanese Academy Awards, but it's made on this super low budget, and it just boosted the reputation of everyone involved because it was so successful, and it was word of mouth that generated it. They showed it in a very small number of cinemas. First of all, audiences loved it, and then the word of mouth spread, and it just became hugely successful. So Adam Terrell likes to keep an eye on, what's happening with low budget productions and highlight there, but also what he's been doing recently. He started a sub-label within Third Window that focuses on these directors' company films. Which are films that were predominantly made in the 80s and 90s when these these film directors, came together and said, right, we want to work out of the studio, outside of the studio system at this time. We want to make films that we want to make outside of that system, do it independently ourselves. Sadly, after about 10 years, this initiative, the director's company, goes bankrupt. Some of these films have been forgotten until recently when Adam had developed a contact in Japan who suddenly found all the negatives of a lot of these old films and he's been working to restore them. So there's an interesting spectrum there of what they've been doing recently. Adam Terrell keeps his nose to the ground in terms of what's happening in low-budget independent production, but he's also going back through the archive, managing to find some films that haven't been released either in Japan or the UK or even both on Blu-ray before, restoring them, he does work with other companies to do this. He sometimes has to give up the rights for how these films are released in the USA or in Europe, but in the UK, these are often Blu-ray premieres of these films, never been seen in this way before. And sometimes he does get some repertory film screenings, cinema screenings for some of these films when they come out. But yeah, a lot of these films, they haven't released on Blu-ray before. There's kind of this, what some scholars would say, almost a lost period of Japanese film history, because these are films that haven't been seen before from the 80s and 90s. So, and they're often independent films that were made at this time. So he's kind of making people aware of what was happening in Japan there at the independent end, as well as keeping an eye on what's happening now in Japan at the independent end. So I'm trying to cover what they're doing, that recent trend in Third Window, as best as I can through an article. It's taken me some time to develop that. As I said, I've gone through one or two drafts, and apologies if Adam is listening that this has been quite a slow process for that article, but sometimes, I hate to say it, that's what academia is. But that article will take shape, and I'll contribute in my own way to promoting what Third Window do, because I just think it's great what they're doing for any fan of Japanese cinema, or even if you're listening to this and you're just a fan of independent cinema and going outside the mainstream to find something a bit different. Pay attention to what Third Window's doing. Some of those filmmakers, the films that they made at the time and what's happening recently, there's some really great examples. Like, if I can plug, and no, I'm not being paid by Adam either, but I am a big fan of his work. I will admit my bias now. I want to plug one of his films that he's got coming out on Blu-ray in the UK later this month in April, A Samurai in Time.
Okay.
This was made on a similarly low budget to One Cut of the Dead. And it's got a great central hook as its concept. This samurai in Edo era Japan suddenly, through a bizarre set of circumstances, finds himself in modern day Tokyo. But everyone thinks he's a samurai actor, so he just gets employed to work on film sets. And so it's this culture clash in that way. I can see you're looking up Samurai in Time now. Yep. This is another case with One Cut of the Dead that has made a lot of money at the Japanese box office, and it's just recently won in the last couple of months Best Picture Film Award at the Japanese Academy Awards. This film that was made for next to nothing compared to the big budget anime adaptations and big budget dramas that they often make at Japanese film studios. This film has come along, made a ton of money, won some of the best film awards of the year, and Adam Terrell caught sight of this early on and thought, this is great, I'm picking up the international distribution rights. So we've got that to look forward to. So I'd highly recommend that to anyone looking for something a bit different from Japan.
Fantastic. I will link all these films. So that
Third
it's
Window's
easier.
website is great for that, and you can see some of the recent Directors Company films as well. There's many great films in their Directors Company sub-label, but I want to highlight one which I was lucky enough to go to a film screening for in London. There's a pop-up cinema that's just started called The Nickel, and I think they have an ongoing relationship with Adam Terrell now because they've shown a few Third Window films. The one I managed to go along and see was a film called Mermaid Legend.
Ooh.
Really good film. It's maybe not for everyone. It's quite an explicit rape revenge tale, but it's not just an exploitation film. I saw it on the big screen and was stunned. It's so artistically impressive and visually impressive and thematically impressive with what it's doing as well. It's not just this bloody action-packed in some scenes rape revenge narrative. It's actually got an ecological kind of theme to it and could be seen as very much, depending on how you interpret it, as very much a pro-feminist narrative too. It's a fantastic example of that genre, which I've sometimes dismissed in the past, especially if you've seen things like I Spit on Your Grave and other exploitation films where they just seem to be done for the blood and guts and nothing else. There's something more to Mermaid Legend. And I'm like, well, this is a really interesting film and I can't believe it's not been seen in the UK before. It's a fascinating film. So that and The Samurai in Time, you'll find lots of details on the Third Window website. So yeah, I'd recommend putting a link to their website in the show notes. Do they say for podcast episodes?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, no, I will. No, I myself are gonna check it out and gonna start watching some of them.
Yeah,
fantastic. John, is there anything else you want to cover before we finish?
I'll stop myself now. I mean, we could have a whole other podcast on Third Window because I have all their DVDs at home. There's so many great recommendations I can make from them. I could make a whole other podcast episode on, what did I say earlier? Takeshi Kitano and Zatoichi. I could give you the whole history but maybe save that for another day because I know you've only got this room booked for so long, haven't you?
Yeah. No, we will do another one. But yes, thank you so much. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you, Raza.
Bye, everyone.